Yes, I achieved this by marrying money, Alex said with a sarcastic grin, throwing these cool words in my face. We were in the chic lobby of the hotel when his loud voice, like a blow, broke the calm atmosphere. I was relaxing, sinking into soft armchairs, when this sudden remark of his, uttered with a contemptuous note, made me feel uncomfortable, as if I had been exposed to everyone. Alex, grinning smugly, seemed to me both proud and childish, as if he took pleasure in exposing me in such a light. "You can keep fighting in your poor life," he continued, not stopping to attack me with ridicule, as if deliberately wanting to hurt me. These words sounded so detached and cruel, as if the person with whom I shared my home and life had turned into a stranger. I couldn't help but wonder, where did he find his new wife, who now proudly bore the title of the daughter of the president of Richard Enterprises? The echo of his words was still ringing in my head when details about this company surfaced in front of me, because its name seemed familiar to me. It was inextricably linked to the business world I grew up in. "My name is Grace, I am 37 years old, and I live with Alex, who became my husband after several years of a rather stormy relationship. I grew up in a family whose life was closely connected with real estate, and from an early age I was taught that one day I would have to take over the management of the family business. My father, a strict and purposeful man, always ran the company with an iron grip, paving the way for the future generation. And this generation was supposed to be me, the only child in the family. The feeling of responsibility for the future of the company sometimes weighed on me like a heavy load, but I tried not to talk about it too often with Alex. Alex, who had not even completed secondary education, found his vocation in a transportation company, and although this job required considerable physical effort and skill, he still felt inferior next to my successes and achievements. His ego often suffered from the contrast of our careers and educational background, and I tried not to mention either my prestigious university or the future that awaited me as president of the company. Our worlds seemed to be so different, but somehow, against all odds, they merged together. Our dating story was almost anecdotal. We met through a mutual friend in college. It was her idea to hire Alex to help with the move. Alex was initially interested in her, but she was busy in other ways, and laughing at his assertiveness, introduced us. However, despite his demanding job, Alex has always tried to maintain a balance in our marriage. Often returning home late, tired of physical labor, he still found the time and energy to be with me, take care of our relationship, for which I felt grateful. I was touched by his efforts, but sometimes it seemed to me that he was straining too much, as if trying to prove something not only to me, but also to himself. His gratitude that I was just cooking dinner after his long working days sometimes sounded like it was a real holiday for him. I was really happy to have such a devoted and attentive husband, although at times it seemed to me that he did not need to put so much effort into simple things. Our marriage was full of such small moments of care and attention that seemed to bind us even more tightly. But one day, after a year of peaceful cohabitation, when we were already in bed and getting ready for bed, Alex suddenly raised a question that made me feel anxious. His voice was slightly irritated, and there was an unusual dissatisfaction in it when he asked, "Why don't we have children yet?" This question took me by surprise. Of course, we've talked about children before, but we've never seriously discussed deadlines or anything like that. I also thought that one day we would become parents, but I always thought that everything would come in due time. We had only been married for a year, and I believed that it was worth waiting for everything to happen naturally. Trying to smooth things over, I calmly replied that it was just a bad time, that we shouldn't worry so early. I assured him that I also wanted children, but I thought that rushing would only add to our stress. However, Alex seemed to be more serious and persistent than usual. He even started to cite some statistics that I had never heard of. 60% of couples who do not use contraceptives conceive within a year. This figure seemed prohibitively high to me, but at that moment I realized how much he longs to become a father. He suggested that we take a test together to find out if we have any problems preventing conception. His offer was reasonable, and I agreed. I suggested that we both take fertility tests. It seemed like a logical and fair decision. But his reaction was unexpected and painful for me. "What are you talking about? Are you saying it's my fault?" His voice became harsh, almost insulting. I was stunned. "That's not what I meant at all. My suggestion was just a practical measure, because we didn't even know what the problem was, if there was one at all." Alex continued to insist that I was trying to blame him, and added with a grin, "It's definitely the woman's fault. You can't get pregnant." The word sounded like a blow. I froze, trying to digest his accusation, not finding the strength to answer. The thought that I might have been the cause of our failures haunted me, but the way he said it, so dismissively and indifferently, hurt me even more. It seemed like he was trying to pin the blame on me, not wanting to think about the fact that it might concern both of us. When I suggested that we discuss our steps again and take the tests together, Alex cut me off. "Just take your tests. I'm too busy at work to do this." His words sounded cold and distant, as if I was just some part of his routine for him. And then came a blow that was particularly painful. "You're just an office lady. You're sitting in the company thanks to your father's connections." These words, spoken with disdain, devalued all the work that I did every day. Yes, I was mainly engaged in administrative activities, but it was temporary. My father taught me management skills so that one day I could lead the family business. I was constantly trying to prove that I was worthy of this role, despite all the difficulties I faced. Alex, on the other hand, never seemed to understand this, as if our marriage in his eyes was reduced to something simpler. It seemed useless to argue with him that night. My every word was met with harsh and sarcastic responses. We went to bed with our backs to each other, and from that moment on, a painful, heavy atmosphere hung between us, which did not disappear anywhere. Alex's attitude towards me completely changed after one conversation with my father. That evening we discussed the future of the company for a long time, and I returned home tired, but satisfied that my father and I had outlined important steps for our family business. However, when I entered the house, I was faced with a completely different attitude. Alex, frowning and clearly displeased, immediately began to reproach me for not cooking dinner. His voice was rough, harsh, and there was that hidden resentment in it that has been increasingly appearing in our conversations in recent months. I tried to smooth the situation over by apologizing and explaining that I had just returned home and would immediately take care of dinner, but Alex muttered something mocking about how this was typical for the boss's daughter in a small company. His comments stung me, because my father's company wasn't small, it was a huge, thriving organization with hundreds of employees, but I knew it was useless to get into an argument. Alex has been increasingly neglectful of my work and my achievements lately, as if everything I did didn't matter against the background of his daily physical efforts. I kept silent, avoiding another conflict, and headed to the kitchen to start cooking. While I was cooking dinner, Alex sat down in an armchair, and I noticed how his mood improved somewhat when he poured himself a glass of wine. Alcohol has become a kind of lifeline for us lately. I saw how every sip seemed to soften its sharpness and make it a little more tolerant of me and everything around me. But it saddened me. Relying on alcohol to keep the peace in our home was not what I was aiming for in a relationship. The next morning, Alex was still annoyed. He got out of bed with the same gloomy mood, and, getting ready for work, almost quit. "Make sure dinner is ready when I get home." His tone was cold, as if our conversation the night before hadn't changed anything. I sighed softly, realizing that today was going to be a difficult day for me. I took the day off to go to the gynecologist for fertility testing, as Alex and I discussed earlier. Although it was my idea to take the tests, it was hard for me to accept that I was the only one who took this step. Alex refused to take the test, and his categorical refusal added to my inner tension. I understood that if the problem turned out to be me, I would have to face this fact, but it would be easier if he were there to support me. The clinic turned out to be busier than I expected, and I had to wait an hour after registration before I was called for an examination. The procedure was quite routine, a medical examination, blood tests, standard questions. In the end, I was told that the results would be ready at the next visit, and I had to return home with a feeling of uncertainty. Although the thought that the problem might be in me haunted me, I decided to remain optimistic and be ready for any steps that might be required for treatment. The thought that Alex was so hungry for children pushed me forward, despite his coldness lately. When Alex returned from work, I told him about my visit to the clinic. His response was dry, almost indifferent. Yes, well, if there are problems with the results, tell me as soon as possible. There was no sympathy or support in those words. I was saddened by his firm conviction that the problem was with me. It was hard for me to accept that the person with whom I shared my life so easily blamed me for our infertility. Fertility testing in itself was not the easiest process. It required time, energy, and moral strength. A little understanding and involvement on his part could have made it much easier for me, but I didn't even get that. 6 years have passed, and I turned 37. Time flowed past us like a stream, and Alex and I's dreams of a family gradually began to dissolve into the mundane and everyday hustle and bustle. We kept trying, but the hope of having children was fading every year. Alex brought up the subject less and less often, and it seemed that he had already come to terms with the fact that we would not have children. His number of nights spent away from home has increased dramatically. Sometimes he didn't come back at all until the morning, justifying himself by sitting with colleagues over a beer or spending time at karaoke. I was increasingly annoyed by this behavior of his, because it was more like the habits of students than an adult man. My job became more and more stressful. The business of my father's company was going uphill, and new responsibilities fell on my shoulders. The thought of family, of children, which was once so important and tremulous, has receded into the background. But Alex's behavior has become too explicit and defiant to ignore. He began to neglect our relationship so much that I began to wonder if we had anything else in common besides the habit of living under the same roof. One evening, when Alex left for the weekend, I noticed that he had left his smartphone in the living room. I picked it up to take it to the bedroom, but at that moment the phone rang. The name, Sandra, appeared on the screen. I assumed it was one of his work contacts, and seeing nothing suspicious about it, I decided to answer to let him know that Alex had left his phone at home. But what I heard shocked me. A cheerful, flirtatious female voice said, "Hey, Alex, you're late. I've been waiting for 50 minutes. If you don't hurry up, we'll miss the opening of the park." My heart sank as the meaning of her words dawned on me. It wasn't just a working conversation. It was a date. I could barely finish the conversation, barely catching my breath. Who is this woman? Why did she speak so easily and freely? Alex is cheating on me. This thought, which first flashed through my mind, fell like a bolt from the blue. I held his phone in my hands, feeling a wave of anger rise inside me. It was undeniable proof of infidelity, his constant absence, coldness in the relationship. Now it all made sense. I realized that he had been living a different life for a long time, and I no longer mattered in this life. Deciding that I would not let this go without consequences, I began to collect evidence. Unlocking his phone was a piece of cake. His date of birth served as a password. In the call history, the name, Sandra, appeared too often to be an accident. When I opened the messaging app, I saw a whole correspondence full of tender, romantic words. These messages made me feel sick. I took screenshots and saved them on my phone, preparing my weapons for the upcoming battle. After that, I calmly put his phone back in its place and spent the rest of the day as if nothing had happened. A month has passed, filled with strange, cold dialogues and silence in our house. And so, one evening, Alex, returning home, suggested that we break up. He talked about the divorce so casually, as if it was a matter of changing the situation, as if he had decided to just change his place. He didn't realize that I already knew about his affair and had been ready for this conversation for a long time. His offer was just the last confirmation for me that it was over. "Yes, let's get divorced," I replied to him with cold confidence. He looked surprised, as if he expected me to start resisting or trying to persuade him to stay. Perhaps he thought that I would hold on to this marriage, but I was already ready for a new stage in my life. Alex's face was filled with unmistakable joy, which he did not try to hide. This joy irritated me to the core, but I suppressed my emotions. I wasn't going to let him see my pain. The next day, Alex brought the divorce papers. He even offered to sue them himself. The whole process seemed almost liberating to him. I just signed the papers without saying a word. I knew that his job was hard and low-paying, and I doubted that he would be able to handle the mortgage alone. But I didn't care anymore. It was his decision, his choice, his consequences. After packing my things, I quietly left the house, leaving behind all the memories, hopes and disappointments that once connected us. 3 days later, I returned to my parents' house. Their warm presence has always helped me cope with difficult periods of my life, and this time was no exception. My parents noticed from the first minute that something was wrong with me. My father was worried, his stern but caring gaze penetrating me as I gathered my thoughts to tell them about the divorce. Mom, who was sitting next to me, was already ready to support me in any decision. I took a deep breath and said that Alex had cheated on me and that our marriage no longer made sense. My confession caused a storm of emotions. Mom jumped up from her seat, her face flushed with anger. My father, who always tried to keep his composure, couldn't help but sigh in exasperation. They couldn't believe that the man they had adopted into the family was capable of such betrayal. There was a determination in their eyes to protect me and justify my choice to break up with him. They have repeatedly said that I made the right decision, that there is no point in holding on to such a relationship. Their support was like a balm to my wound, helping me feel confident in my future again, even without Alex. In an attempt to forget about the past, I plunged into work with my head. Working for my father's company has always given me a sense of stability, and now it has become a real refuge for me from painful memories. The days flew by unnoticed, absorbed in business, meetings, and projects. The year flew by like a flash, filled with endless responsibilities and professional successes. I threw myself into my work, trying not to think about what I had lost. Sometimes it seemed to me that I no longer remember what it was like to live outside the office, outside of work. One evening, when I was relaxing in the living room after another long day at work, my father came up to me. His voice was soft but serious. "Why don't you take a break and go on a trip? You work hard, it shows. You need to rest," he said, looking at me with fatherly concern. I couldn't disagree more. Lately, I've really been feeling mentally and physically exhausted. Work has become a way for me to escape from pain, but now I realize that running away is exhausting me even more. Taking my father's advice, I decided to go to the Northeast, to a place I had long dreamed of. It was my first trip alone, and to be honest, it scared me a little. But at the same time, I was full of joyful excitement, like a child embarking on an unknown adventure. I booked a hotel in Portland, one of the most picturesque cities in the region, and in the coming days I started to get ready to travel. When I finally arrived, the air of the Northeast greeted me with its coolness and freshness, as if clearing me of all the worries that had accumulated over the past year. The people here turned out to be surprisingly kind and helpful. They helped me navigate the place, advised me where to go, and one day, talking with the owner of a small cozy bar, I felt that I was gradually healing. His simple conversation about life and everyday life was an unexpected gift for me, a reminder that the world is still full of joy and light, even when it seems that everything is falling apart. After checking into the hotel, I decided to afford a little luxury. The hotel was old, with an elegant interior, reminiscent of the times when every corner was thought out to the smallest detail. I relaxed in the cozy lobby with a welcome drink, feeling all the fatigue that had accumulated after a long journey disappear from me. At one point, it even occurred to me that it would be nice to move here permanently. But suddenly everything changed in an instant. I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Hey, what are you doing here?" A voice sounded that made my skin crawl. I turned around, and Alex was standing in front of me. My ex-husband. He had 2 huge suitcases in his hands, and next to him stood a young woman, about 20 years old, with bright makeup and catchy red nails, despite the cold weather. I could barely utter a word from the shock, but soon I didn't have to ask. Alex, with a smile on his face, said, "Let me introduce you, this is Sandra, my new wife." The words seemed to come from another world. Honeymoon, rich dad. He said all this with such enthusiasm, as if he took special pleasure in plunging a knife into my wound. Alex's face lit up with sudden pride, and he continued to talk with some strange glee about how his new wife, Sandra, lives in luxury thanks to her family's business. He did not hide his irony when he sarcastically thanked me for the Geezy divorce, making it clear that, thanks to him, he was able to start a new life without any financial difficulties. "Thank you for divorcing me so easily, Grace," he said, his voice full of mockery, but at that moment it didn't touch me. Inside of me, something was laughing at his pathetic attempts to rise at the expense of someone else's wealth. "Yes, I know them," I replied calmly. "Their office is in the largest building in the city center, isn't it?" Alex, who didn't expect me to be so knowledgeable, was a little confused. "Have you been there?" I asked with a slight smile on my face. Apparently, he did not expect me to be aware of such details. His face clouded for a moment, but then he continued his speech as if nothing had happened. "Of course, her family owns a huge company. They recently paid off the mortgage on our new house," Alex said with obvious pride, thinking that this would finally surprise me. However, I was ready for his remarks and only replied in a calm tone, "Yes, their business is really impressive. But you probably don't know that the construction of this property, where their office is located, is also part of my father's assets." My words sounded casual, as if I had only remembered this fact in the course of the conversation. Alex and Sandra froze in place, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" Alex asked, still not fully understanding what I was getting at. Sandra stood next to him, her face taking on a serious expression, while anxiety flashed in her eyes. "This building where your office is located is rented by my father for his company," I continued, feeling my calmness destroy their confidence. "Your tenant has been delaying payments for the past few months, and my father has already been forced to send several reminders." Alex's face changed. His pride, like a thin mask, began to crack under the weight of my words. "Is Richard Enterprises your tenant?" Sandra said this with obvious skepticism, but I could see her confidence starting to melt. Alex, on the contrary, tried to hold on, but his voice became louder and sharper. "You're just trying to separate us." "It's a lie," he shouted, but there was a note of fear and panic in his voice. Not wanting to continue empty conversations, I decided to back up my words with evidence. I took out my smartphone and dialed my father's number. He replied immediately, and after briefly explaining the situation, I asked him to send me a photo of one of the latest rent reminders. A few minutes later, an image of a document appeared on my phone screen, which clearly stated, "Richard Enterprises owed several months of rent." I showed this image to Alex and Sandra, watching their faces turn pale from shock. Sandra laughed a nervous laugh. "It's impossible, our company is doing great," she said with feigned confidence, but her voice no longer sounded as shrill as before. Alex stood silently, his smug smile gone. A mixture of disbelief and fear of the inevitable consequences appeared in his eyes. "If you don't pay the rent soon, my father may have to sue," I added, watching the shock on their faces turn to alarm. A feeling of satisfaction flared up inside me, but I held back my emotions. I knew it was important to stay calm now, so as not to sink to their level. Sandra muttered something uncertain, her voice trembling. Dad has been annoyed lately, she said quietly. He complained about the decline in sales, but I didn't think it was that serious. Alex, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, found nothing better than to start screaming. "It's all a lie," he shouted, his voice echoing through the lobby, attracting the gazes of outsiders. "You're just trying to ruin our lives. You're jealous. You can't accept that I'm happy with someone else." I took a step back, not immediately responding to his accusations. Dirty tactics? Is he really accusing me of revenge? I remembered all the heartless words he had hurled at me during our marriage. His constant humiliation, unwillingness to understand and support me. Alex stood in front of me, haggard and confused, his former self-confidence dissolved like mist under the sun. He couldn't seem to believe what was happening. My words struck at the very core of his being, tearing out the remnants of his pride, like roots pulling dry grass out of the ground. "Are you pregnant?" His voice was trembling, and there was a mixture of shock and jealousy in his eyes. "How? You used birth control when we were married. How is this possible?" He looked like a man who suddenly lost his footing, as if everything he thought was true turned out to be an illusion. I took a deep breath, feeling the wave of long-accumulated emotions begin to recede, leaving behind a sense of liberation. "Contraceptives?" I asked in disbelief, knowing full well that Alex was trying to shift the blame back to me. "I've never used them, Alex. Do you remember when I told you that I was examined and the doctors didn't find any problems with me? You chose not to pay attention to it and instead blamed me. And as it turned out, the problem wasn't with me." His face paled, as if the weight of the whole truth had suddenly fallen on him. I saw a flash of panic in his eyes, the realization that his new life with Sandra would not bring what he dreamed of. His shoulders slumped, and I heard him mutter something under his breath. "It means that Sandra and I won't be able to have children?" His voice barely reached me, filled with despair. It was the first time I saw him so vulnerable, so broken. Sandra stood next to me, frowning, her eyes darting from me to Alex, as if she, too, was trying to grasp the full depth of what was happening. "Why did you marry me then?" she suddenly asked with bitterness in her voice. "You said that I would give you heirs. You talked about our happy life." Her voice gradually faded, and an expression appeared on her face that could hardly be called anything other than disappointment. Alex looked at her in confusion, as if he couldn't find the right words to explain his betrayal. "I do not know how you feel right now, Alex," I said quietly, watching him toss and turn, "but I know one thing. From now on, I ask you not to interfere in my life anymore." My words were calm, but there was an unchanging firmness in them. "As for your relationship with Sandra and your rent problems, that's not my concern. You and I don't owe each other anything anymore. My life is mine now, and you are no longer a part of it." Alex tried to say something, his mouth opened, but before he could say a word, I resolutely turned around and took a step back. I saw Sandra look at him with an expression of incomprehension, and then her eyes turned back to me. But there was no longer the contempt in her gaze that I had seen before. Sandra was young, and her assumed confidence was now crumbling like a house of cards. "I wish you good luck," I said finally, without turning around. There was a calmness in my head that I hadn't felt in months, if not years. I felt like all the weight of the past that had been weighing on me for so long had finally disappeared. "I'm done with Alex completely." His pathetic voice still sounded in my head, but it didn't cause a single drop of regret. His desperate attempt to get back into my life was nothing more than the last, futile jerk of a drowning man who seized on an opportunity that had already passed. I felt freed from the heavy burden of the past, and now a life full of new opportunities and hopes awaited me. When I returned home after the trip, it was like stepping into a new world. My husband greeted me with a smile full of warmth and care, filling me with a sense of peace that I missed so much. His simple welcome sounded like music, bringing me back to reality, where I was truly happy. I hugged him, feeling like everything in my life finally fell into place. Every day since I married my new husband has been filled with peace and joy. His support and love have made my life what I could only dream of. There was no point in remembering Alex anymore. Our paths finally parted, and now I could build a future where there was no room for resentment, disappointment, and anger. The news of the collapse of Richard Enterprises came out of the blue shortly after my trip. The company Alex had counted on so much was ruined due to years of fraud. The financial scandal has engulfed the entire media space. The company's shares collapsed, employees left en masse, and now no one wanted to deal with Richard Enterprises. Sandra's father tried desperately to hide the scale of the crisis, but the truth came out, as it always does. Alex, of course, was not prepared for this turn of events. He, who was used to relying on other people's money and connections, suddenly found himself with nothing. His dreams of an easy life with an heiress collapsed with the collapse of Richard Enterprises. Until recently, confident in his future, he was now just a man mired in debt and despair. He blamed everyone but himself, from Sandra's father to me, but it didn't matter anymore. I was told that their marriage turned into endless quarrels. Sandra, having learned about his infertility, could no longer tolerate his false promises and claims. She accused him of dragging her into his problems while her family was going through the most difficult crisis in their history. In the end, they divorced, everyone went their separate ways, but this time Alex was left with nothing. When he called me, asking for forgiveness and begging for a new chance, I felt a mixture of pity and disgust. His request to marry him again sounded like the last cry of despair, but I no longer felt attached to this man. His life was just an episode from the past for me now, which I closed forever. "No, Alex," I said calmly, "I don't have feelings for you anymore. I am happy with my husband and our future child. Please don't try to interfere in my life again. Goodbye." These words sounded like the final point in our relationship. I didn't expect any answers from him. I didn't expect any more apologies. I just blocked his number and closed the door to the past. Alex, left alone, with debts and no hope for the future, will probably now wander in his unfulfilled dream of an easy life. But that's not my problem anymore. His path has become a distant, alien one for me. I was sure that only bright days were ahead of me, the birth of a child, career development, and, most importantly, the love and support of my husband, who became my real supports. Now I could look forward to the future with joy. My life has found a harmony that I missed so much before. I knew that I still had many challenges and difficulties ahead of me, but now I was sure of one thing: I was ready for anything, because there was a person next to me who truly loved me and was ready to support me in any trials.